A low winter sun leans weakly through the crooked glass, pale and exhausted, casting long slanted lines across a room too used to shadow. The beams above sag with the weight of time and soot, blackened not by flame, but by the quiet breath of century smoke rising from the same hearth that now lies ash-grey and still. In its silence, the room breathes with memory, beneath a wool blanket, scratchy as dried reeds and nearly as thin a child stirs. Their skin is chapped, pinked raw at the knuckles, breath shallow in the thick, smoked air, curled tight against the shape of their sleeping mother. They share warmth the way the poor always have by pressing close, by learning to make stillness into shelter. The soundscape is not silence, but a tapestry of weary sounds, a wheeze from the old man behind the partition, the brittle crack of wood shrinking in the cold, a grunt from someone turning in their sleep. Outside, the frost glazes, the thatch like a crown of thorns. But inside, the warmth is deceptive, heavy with the staleness of breath and old beer. There is no fire now, only smoke that lingers like the memory of heat. The child's eyes settle on the copper pitcher by the hearth. The surface is dulled, dented, its lip chipped, but still it holds the morning's inheritance. Yesterday's ale, flat, lukewarm, steeped in yeast and the faintest sweetness of boiled grain. Water had become a story people stopped telling. The well, once a place of blessing, had become something whispered about only in warnings. The girl from across the green had drunk from it last winter. She hadn't walked again, so now even the smallest among them drank beer. Not out of revelry, but necessity, a bitter safety in a clay mug. The child reaches for the pitcher with fingers stiff from cold and routine, lifts it with both hands, and drinks. It slides down like ash and firelight. Their mother stirs, but does not wake. She smells of barley mash and peat smoke, of damp wool and something older. More faded exhaustion passed down in flesh and breath. She had once told stories at night, soft things about saints and stags and bells, but her voice had grown quieter with each passing winter. Now she mostly murmurs in her sleep, words half swallowed by the smoke. The morning drags itself into the corners of the room, reluctant and slow. The others begin to rise, children first, then the bent backs of the aging. No one speaks. They simply shift from sleep into movement, like embers stirred in a dying fire. The same hands that once clutched, in dreams now reach for cloaks, bread crusts, the shared jug. The air is dense, not from bodies alone, but from what hangs between them, what is unsaid, unwelcome. Grief, memory, the scent of death that never quite leaves when winter is long and roofs leak, and the youngest cough without stopping, outside hooves crunch, across the frostbitten road, and the family pauses to listen, not in curiosity, but caution. Visitors bring questions. Questions bring risk. And no one here has time for risk. The father has already gone. Left before dawn, his shape lost to the fog, his breath trailing behind him like smoke. He works the fields beyond the hill, soil frozen hard as iron. What he earns buys flour and grain. When there's enough to buy it all, most mornings he carries a skin of stronger ale than the children drink. A man's drink, it's called, one that burns going down and numbs the ache in his knees and his faith alike. Sometimes he sings when he returns, and sometimes he doesn't return at all. The smoke rises now, not from a fresh fire, but from the embers being coaxed back to life. The oldest son crouches low, blowing gently, feeding it with twigs, bits of last season's dry hay. Slowly, flame reclaims the hearth, and with it comes life, the rattling of pots, the slap of wet dough, the thick, sour scent of porridge. But the smoke returns too. It climbs the walls like ivy. It soaks into their clothes, their hair, their lungs. It is unwanted, but not unwelcome. It keeps the lice away. It keeps the rot from the beams. It covers the stink of sickness. And perhaps, if one listens closely, it keeps something darker at bay, a silence that creeps in when no one speaks for too long, when too many faces are missing from the morning light. The child watches the curl of grey drift toward the rafters. The beams are old, carved once with symbols, now faded beneath the smoke marks, meant to ward off devils, or maybe just the dark. The walls whisper. Every home does, in winter. A bird flutters at the shutter a finch, perhaps disoriented, seeking heat it cannot have. Its wings scratch lightly against the wood, desperate. The child watches it, unmoving. And then it's gone back into the cold mist that swallows everything. Eventually, people, dreams, even names. And yet, inside, the small rituals continue. A cup passed, a crust broken, a fire tended. This is not joy, it is not even hope, but it is living, and in these rooms, that is enough. The child curls back beneath the blanket beside their mother. She does not wake, but her arm shifts, resting protectively across the child's shoulder. A gesture not of strength, but of habit. It is what remains when everything else has been taken. The ale pitcher is empty now. The smoke thickens, and somewhere, beyond the frost-laced walls, the bells of the abbey toll once, twice, 3 times, for morning prayers, for the dead, for something no one remembers anymore. The child listens, and then, slowly, their eyes close again. There is no miracle in this house, only the steady rhythm of breath, the taste of old grain on the tongue, and the smoke that holds the roof in place like an invisible hand. Tomorrow will come, and with it the next ache, the next cup, the next story left untold. But for now, in this warm and shadowed silence, they endure, and somewhere in that silence, something else waits. The faint echo of a name spoken in another room, a secret stitched into the rafters, a memory hidden behind the fire's glow. It is nearly time. The next door is about to open. It began with the sound of coughing wet, rhythmic, persistent. At first, it came from the neighboring house, then from the barn, then from behind the chapel wall, where the acolyte boy had once sung like birdsong in spring. Now only his father's shovel echoed across the stone, breaking ground that had already forgotten warmth. Inside, the smoke thickened again, not just from the hearth, but from the way the air itself grew heavy, heavy with breath, heavy with fear. The child sat at the edge of the pallet bed, watching their mother press a cloth to her lips, the fabric blooming red at the center like a poppy crushed in the snow. No one called it plague. Not yet, but they stopped visiting, stopped blessing loaves, stopped touching skin. The cold had deepened, but it wasn't winter that stole the light this time. It was silence, that heavy, uncanny silence that comes when neighbors lock their doors, not from thieves, but from each other. The well, once forgotten in its danger, was now a desperate risk. Even the ale was running thin. No time to brew, no strength to boil. Barley sacks sat unopened, guarded like gold. The house had become a prison of breath and smoke. At night, the child heard footsteps, slow, dragging, down the road. No voices, No lanterns, just the sound of wooden soles on frozen mud, and then nothing. The wind would return, soft and cruel. The villagers stopped ringing the bell for the dead. It had rung too often, too loud, and now even grief had grown weary of its own echo. Inside, the fire still burned, low and stubborn. The father sat by it now, hands splayed before the glow. His skin looked grey in the firelight, his breath slow, but he did not speak. He hadn't spoken since they buried the infant, the one who'd never learned to cry, only to wheeze and fade. The mother no longer asked him to. There were no priests anymore, just whispers through walls and herbs tied to doorposts. The child had begun to keep track of the days by counting the birds. 1 crow on the thatchil omen, 2 meant nothing, 3 was hope. But 3 had not come in many mornings, then 1. Night, the child heard it, not a cough, not a whisper, but the sound of sobbing through the smoke. Not from inside the house, but from somewhere beyond the hearth, behind the partition wall. A thin wall, one the father had built back when there were enough children to justify a second room. Now there was only 1 child left. 1 room was enough. And yet, behind the wall, the sobbing went on. The child rose from the pallet and crossed the room. The air was so thick with smoke that it blurred the lantern's glow, casting long shadows that writhed across the low ceiling. They pressed a hand to the partition. Mother, no answer. She was asleep by the fire, her breath shallow, face turned to the stone. Father, still no voice, and yet the sobbing persisted. Slowly, the child pressed their ear against the wood. The sobs had rhythm, a child's rhythm. Short, gasping, helpless. It sounded familiar, but no one lived behind that wall. Not anymore. They waited, listened. The sound faded, drawn away like breath through the thatch, and the silence returned. Close and clinging by morning, the sound was gone. So was the crow. The mother rose slower that day. Her legs trembled beneath her weight. Her hands trembled even more. She held her cup with both hands, but the ale still sloshed onto her lap. She did not notice. "We will need to burn more peat," she murmured. "There's no more peat," the father said. His voice startled them both. He looked older than he had yesterday. The lines on his face had turned deep, like dry riverbeds, and yet his eyes were focused on the child. "You heard her," he said softly. The child didn't speak. "The crying," he continued. "You heard it too." They nodded. He looked to the mother, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. "It's not the dead we should fear," he said. "It's the ones we forget." Later that day, the child found the old rosary hidden beneath the floorboard near the hearth. The beads were cracked, blackened by smoke, but the crucifix was warm to the touch. They didn't pray with it. They simply held it like a stone from a familiar road. A road they might walk again if the world ever softened. The crying did not return, but something else did. That night, as they lay on the pallet half dreaming, the child opened their eyes to see a figure in the smoke, not formed, not clearly, just the outline of small shoulders, the weight of presence. It didn't speak, it didn't move. It simply stood near the hearth, where the infant had once been wrapped in cloth and kissed goodbye. The fire did not flicker, the smoke did not shift. The child blinked once, twice, and the figure was gone. No one spoke of it, not the next day, not the day after, but the father hung herbs over the lintel, and the mother began boiling the ale with crushed garlic and sage. They did not speak of plague, but they had begun to fear something older, something tied not to disease but to memory, to what clings to the beams and settles into the dust, to what walks in smoke and silence. The child still counted the birds, and one morning 3 came, perched together on the frost-trimmed thatch, silent and black, a sign not of peace, but of a change coming, something moving beneath the surface of things, beneath the soot, beneath the skin. The smoke curled higher that day, and in its tendrils something old stirred awake. The road would open soon, a journey none of them had asked for, but one that could no longer be delayed. The road was never silent, even when no footsteps touched it, even when the wind died down and the crows took shelter in the yew trees. The road still breathed. It held the weight of every soul that had ever fled or returned along its crooked spine damp with centuries of hoofprints, cart tracks, and barefoot children sent to beg for bread. And now it would carry them too. The father rose before dawn, before the smoke had even gathered its breath in the hearth. He stood in the center of the room, shoulders stooped not from age, but from decision, his pack already slung across his back, a bundle of flint and bread and the skin of bitter ale strapped to his hip. He didn't wake them gently. He simply placed his hand on the child's shoulder, firm, wordless, final. The mother was slower to rise. Her joints crackled like firewood, her movements uncertain. She moved as though something were still tethering her to the floor. And in a way, there was a burial not yet made, a name still echoing in the walls. They took only what they could carry, a blanket, a knife, the last of the barley loaf, the beads the child refused to part with. The house behind them remained warm embers, still glowing faintly in the hearth, but the warmth felt unnatural now, too still, too heavy. The father latched the door with a rusted hook, and then out of habit or hope etched a small cross in the soot above the lintel dot. They left without ceremony. No goodbyes to neighbors, no last looks, just footsteps on frost-hardened dirt and the long road ahead. They did not speak much that day. Only the crows did, following them from tree to tree with hoarse, curious calls. The child kept their eyes down, counting stones in the road, avoiding the gaze of roadside shrines and broken mile markers. The world had grown strange, as if emptied of color. Even the sky seemed to droop, heavy with unfallen snow. They passed the churchyard by midday. What once had been a place of hymns and gathering was now silent, the windows blackened by soot and boarded shut. A rough plank had been nailed to the door, a crude hand scrawled in ash stay away. No priest, no prayer, only the overgrown graves and the bell rope snapped clean. The mother paused, pressing her hand to the gate. Her lips moved, but the wind stole the words. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the forest. The trees here were not friendly things, not the sort children played beneath or lovers carved names into. These trees leaned inward, twisted and brittle, like old women in mourning. The path narrowed to a single track, and the smoke from their small campfire curled upward like a question no one would answer. The child didn't sleep that night. Instead, they watched the shadows gather at the edge of the firelight, watched the smoke shift like breath, as if something walked just beyond reach. The woods made sounds they couldn't name Ruslin's, sighs, a faint creak like a door opening far away. The kind of sounds that made one remember every forgotten sin in the early hours. The mother reached for the child's hand. "There's a place beyond the hills," she whispered, "where the rivers don't rot and the fields still turn green. Is it real?" the child asked. She didn't answer. She only looked toward the smoke, where the trees bent low and the stars were already gone. The next morning, they found the cottage. It stood alone, half collapsed in a clearing, its roof sunken and moss-covered, one shutter hanging like a broken limb. But it had a door, and the chimney was still whole, and that was enough. The father tested the hinges. The door groaned, then gave way. Inside, the air was stale with mildew and ash, but it did not smell of death. Not yet. They settled there, for lack of better. The hearth took time to coax back to life, the stone reluctant to remember heat, but soon the smoke returned slipping up into the rafters, thickening the silence. It wasn't home, but it would keep the frost off their bones. They spent the next day gathering, kindling, bark, frozen roots, a single turnip still clinging to the frozen ground like a secret. The mother boiled it in ale, and they ate in near silence, chewing slowly, tasting more memory than flavor. That night the sobbing returned, but this time it came from outside. The child heard it first, just past the shudder, near the edge of the trees. A girl's voice, thin, trembling. "Mama." They froze. The father reached for the knife. The mother shook her head, whispering something under her breath, a prayer, or maybe a warning. The child crawled to the shutter and peered through a gap. In the wood nothing, only frost. Bare branches, smoke drifting sideways in the wind. But the voice came again, closer. "Mama, I'm cold." The voice was wrong. Too slow, as if spoken through water. As if the mouth that formed the words didn't quite remember how to move. The father poured a circle of ash near the door. The mother wept without sound. They didn't sleep, and by morning the ground outside bore no footprints. No sign of child or beast. But the crows were gone. They left the cottage at first light. The child didn't ask why. They walked west now, toward the line of hills the mother had whispered about. But something had shifted. They no longer moved to escape plague or poverty now. They moved to outrun memory, and memory, as they would soon learn, does not stay buried. It travels in smoke. It walks in the mouths of lost children. It sings in voices that mimic the living dot as they climbed the first hill. The child looked back once. Smoke still rose from the chimney behind them, but it wasn't their fire. Anymore, it was something older, something that had waited, watched, and now followed. Ahead lay valleys of mist, villages unknown, faces unfamiliar. But the child's thoughts were not on what lay ahead. They were on the voice in the dark, the one that knew their name, and the place where the road would finally stop. It was not dawn that woke them, but the sound of a bell that should not have rung, faint, distant, as if under water, and yet unmistakable. Not the high peal of a church tower, nor the clatter of a town gate. This was something deeper, older, a single chime, drawn out like breath held too long. They stood on the ridgeline, cloaks stiff with frost, eyes squinting toward the valley below. Fog coiled thick and pale in the hollows, hiding the land like an unspoken truth. Somewhere beneath that shroud, something waited. The mother crossed herself. The father only listened. The child watched the sky. There were no birds. They descended the slope slowly, boots sinking into mud that was too soft for a land still frozen. Trees gave way to sparse pasture. Land went green, now grey, dotted with collapsed fences and gateposts lost to rot. They passed. No other travellers. The road had narrowed again, but this time not from trees or weather. From neglect, the fog clung to their legs as they walked, thickening with each step, until the world behind them vanished entirely. It was as if the land itself had forgotten how to lift its head. Then out of the mist it appeared, a village, silent, stone. Cottages sagged into themselves, roofs bowed and patched with rush. A well stood at the centre, half covered with rotting boards, a broken bucket dangling like a corpse on a noose. Doors hung open, not from welcome, but from abandonment. And still, that sound the bell once more, low and singular. Goning the... Father gripped the child's shoulder. "Do not stray," he said. It was not warning, it was plea. The village had no dogs, no smoke, no footsteps. Just that sound, echoing from a chapel on the far edge, steeple cracked. Its bell rope long gone. They entered the square slowly. The wind had vanished. Even the smoke from their own breath curled downward. Unnatural, the air felt like water. Cold, pressing. "Should we knock?" the mother asked, voice barely more than breath. "No," the father said. The child said nothing. Their eyes had fixed on something else scratched into the doorframe of one cottage, barely visible through. Mould and time. We remember her name. Beneath it, a handprint. Small, too small for any adult. They walked past the inn, the forge, the weaver's shop, all still, all abandoned mid-life. A table still set, a half-mended cloak left on the loom, and always that same scent riding beneath the rot. Smoke, yes, but not fresh. Old smoke, cold smoke, like something burnt long ago, and still hanging in the bones of the buildings. They reached the chapel just as the bell chimed again. This time, the sound came from within, not the bell tower, the nave. The door was ajar. Inside it was dark but not silent. The sound of movement, bare feet on stone, cloth brushing against pews. Shapes stirred in the shadow, but not clearly. The air was thicker here, harder to breathe. They stepped across the threshold. The chapel's walls were scorched in places, as though fire had tried to eat them and failed. The altar stood bare, stripped of its relics. In the apse behind it, a single candle burned unlit, yet somehow glowing. Beside it stood a figure, a girl, draped in linen, barefoot, her head bowed. The child felt it first, pressure behind the eyes, like a memory forcing its way back into the body. And then a smell, sweet, acrid, wrong. Not death, not incense. Barley, burnt barley. The girl lifted her head. Her eyes were clouded with ash. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The father stepped forward, reaching for the child's hand, but they were already moving. Drawn that, the girl turned and walked slowly toward a door behind the altar. It creaked open without touch. Smoke poured from the gap, not rising, but falling, thick and slow, like oil. They followed. Down narrow stairs, slick with moss and age, down into stone tunnels, meant for cellars or penance or hiding. The candlelight flickered behind them. The mother cried quietly. The father whispered prayers he hadn't spoken since his own childhood. The girl did not look back. The passage ended in a circular room walls, lined with stone shelves, each one holding an object. A child's shoe, a tooth, a wooden doll split. At the head, a braid of hair bound with black ribbon. The air pulsed, not from heat. From memory, the girl turned and pointed to one shelf in particular, an empty space. Then she looked to the child and waited. The child stepped forward from beneath. Their cloak, They pulled the rosary, the one from the hearth, the one warm even in frost. They placed it in the empty space, and the smoke stopped moving. Silence fell, true silence. The girl nodded once, then faded, not walking, not vanishing, but falling backward into shadow, like a dream remembered too late. They left the room without speaking. When they emerged, the chapel was empty, the candle gone, the air no longer thick. Outside, the mist had lifted. Only slightly, but enough. The father looked to the village. It still stood silent, but something had changed. The door with the handprint was closed now. The well had been covered fully. A raven watched from the chapel roof, unmoving. They did not stay the night as they crossed the far road. The bell rang one final time. Not a warning, not a curse, a release, and with it, the first breeze they had felt in days cold, clean, pushing them forward. They walked on, toward whatever came next, behind them. The village fell still once more, but in the chapel's cellar, the shelf was no longer empty, and the smoke had finally gone. The wind carried them now, not with kindness, but with purpose. It moved through the branches like a messenger, bending the trees just enough to whisper, "Keep moving." And so they did, through narrow passes where frost clung like old guilt, across fields where no crop had dared rise in years. The world behind them had become quiet to quiet, and what lay ahead was uncertain, but silence, at least, had stopped following them. For now the father walked ahead, his gait slow but steady. The mother lingered behind, her breath more labored each day. And the child walked between them, not held, not guided, but tethered by something deeper, something wordless and smoke-born. It was the child who saw the monastery spire first. It jutted from the trees like a broken tooth, blackened by age, but unmistakable. They had not expected a monastery this far west. The last had been burned down by raiders 3 winters ago. This one stood untouched, shrouded in ivy, nestled in a hollow where the mist pooled thickest. They approached without speaking. The outer wall had partially collapsed, leaving a narrow entry between the stones. Inside, the grounds were strangely clean, no bones, no ash, just moss and stillness. The cloisters curved in on themselves, arches framing a garden where nothing grew but nettles and a single yew tree, twisted and hunched like an old nun bowed in prayer. And then there were the monks, still, not statues, not men, figures robed in black, seated in the cloister's corners, faces hidden beneath deep hoods. They did not move, they did not speak. They simply sat, as if frozen in contemplation. Something far worse. The father hesitated. The mother crossed herself. The child stepped forward. Inside the monastery, candlelight flickered through narrow stained glass windows, depicting no saints, no angels, only abstract shapes, spirals, eyes, flame, the kind of art made not to comfort, but to remind. The great hall lay open. A long wooden table ran its length, set for a feast that had never been served. Bowls carved from bone, cups of unpolished pewter. At the head of the table, a chair larger than the rest, carved with runes the child could not read. They passed it in silence. In the scriptorium, the air tasted of ink and mildew. The shelves still held books bound in leather, some in skin, all crumbling at the corners. The child ran their hand along one spine and felt it shiver, not move shiver, as if the word inside still remembered being spoken. On the writing desk, a single parchment lay unfurled, A prayer hafinis Domini, liberanus, logi, deliverus. But the ink had trailed off mid-letter. The quill snapped in two. The father gathered nothing. He would not steal from a place like this. The mother sat on a bench and closed her eyes. Her breathing had grown shallow. Her hands trembled when she reached for the ale flask. The child watched her closely, seeing something unspoken settle behind her eyes. Grief, yes, but also knowing. They found the dormitory just before dusk. Wooden pallets lined the floor, each with a folded robe atop it. No dust, no insects, as if someone still tended them. They slept there that night. The father kept watch, knife in hand, but nothing came. Not footsteps, not wind, not even dreams, only the occasional creak of ancient beams, and the rustling of parchment in the next room, as if the monastery breathed in its sleep. In the early dark, the child stirred. Something had woken them. Not a sound, but a feeling, a weight in the chest, like memory stirred too fast. They rose, careful not to wake the others, and stepped barefoot into the corridor. The monks were gone. Their robes remained, folded neatly in their places, as if the bodies inside had simply vanished, and where they had sat, a new symbol had been carved into the stone. A ring, within it, a smaller ring, and at the center, a single drop of what blood ink. Water the child could not tell. They ran to the chapel. There, behind the altar, the yew tree had cracked through the stone floor, roots splitting tile, reaching toward the nave-like veins, across a pale wrist. The candle from the ruined village burned here now, unlit, and yet glowing. Beside it, a book stood open, but no hands had turned its pages. The child stepped forward. They did not read. They remembered, not in words, but in sensation. The cold breath of a sibling lost to fever, the soft scrape of a burial cloth drawn too tight, the taste of bitter ale in a silent house, the weight of smoke in lungs too young to know better. They pressed their palm to the open page, and the candle flared just once, then faded behind them. Their mother whispered she had followed. Her voice cracked as she spoke, brittle and ancient. This place was never holy, she said. It was made for remembering. And then she wept not from fear, but from release. When morning came, they buried her beneath the yew. The father dug the grave in silence. The child gathered stones to mark it. There was no priest, no bell, only the wind and the yew leaves, and the candle that refused to die. They left the monastery before midday. The father did not speak for many hours. When he did, it was to say only this: "We must reach the Black Road by All Souls' Eve, or she follow." The child didn't ask who she was. They already knew. The wind had changed again, no longer a whisper, now a hum, and the smoke, though distant, had returned. It would find them again, but they would be ready. The Black Road was older than stone. It was older than the village graves, older than the monasteries, older even than the trees whose roots no longer dared to reach beneath it. It did not twist or curve like the rest of the world. It ran straight, cruel, without hesitation, like judgment, like memory. By the time they reached it, the father's gait had changed. He no longer marched forward, but leaned inward, as though something unseen pressed against his chest. The child noticed the shift, the pauses when he thought no one looked, the way his fingers trembled when they passed a shrine. Even one long defaced the road greeted them with silence, not the soft kind, not the hush of reverence or snowfall. This was a silence that refused to be filled, a void stretched across dirt. and sky. The child felt it before their boots even touched the edge, the way the air changed. How even the crows flew higher, avoiding its invisible spine. It had no name, but those who lived in the hills once called it Via Umbra, the road of shadows. They walked anyway. There were no milestones here, no inns, no markers. Only blackened stones set deep into the earth, each one smooth as bone, warm even beneath the frost. The child once reached out to touch one and recoiled. It burned, not with fire, but with memory, like placing a hand into a dream too large to hold. By the second day, the father began to speak in his sleep. At first, the child could not understand the word's old tongue, guttural and broken, like something pulled from beneath the earth. But on the third night, his voice grew clearer. "You shouldn't have brought the rosary back," he muttered. "She marked it. She marked us." The child did not wake him. Instead, they stared up into the night sky, looking for stars that no longer appeared. The fog followed them now, thin as breath, trailing just far enough behind to remind them it hadn't forgotten. They passed things on that road. They passed a pair of boots, side by side in the dust, their laces tied in a neat bow. Beside them, a cap. No body. Later, a line of scorched stones where a fire had been lit, long cold. In the center, a child's drawing etched in soot, a house, a bird, a figure with no face. And then, near dusk, a door, just a door, standing upright in the road, unconnected to wall or frame or house. Its wood blackened, handle rusted, but it stood without falling, as if daring them. The father refused to touch it. The child couldn't look away. Behind the door, they felt something wait. Not evil, not quite, but recognition. The way a place recognizes your name before you've spoken. They walked around it, leaving a wide circle in the dirt. It never turned, but the child felt it watching long after it was behind them that night. The fire wouldn't catch. The air was too damp. The stones too slick. The father cursed under his breath, then lit a small candle from the monastery, one of the few they'd kept. It burned low, blue at the edges, and with it came the singing, not from nearby, from below, a voice, high and young, carrying through the stones. A lullaby, soft as ash. "Sleep, my child, the light is thin, the smoke has teeth, the dark draws in." The child didn't speak, didn't breathe. The father only said, "Do not answer her." The candle flickered, then went out, but the singing continued. "Sleep, my child, the bell has rung, they've cut the tongue, they've cut the tongue." The next morning, the father was gone, no trail, no pack missing, only the faint scent of burnt cloth, and a single handprint left in the frost beside where he had slept, too small to be his. The child did not cry. Instead, they placed the candle back in their satchel and continued. The black road did not narrow. It did not twist. It simply kept going. But something had changed. The fog had caught up. It clung now to the trees, thick and low, pressing in from both sides. The world beyond the path had shrunk. There was no forest anymore, no sky, only the line of stone beneath their feet, and the sound of their own breathing, and the footsteps, soft, deliberate, always just behind. The child did not run, running. They knew would invite it closer. Instead, they walked. They walked until the sun vanished again, and they came upon the stone archway. It was simple, 2 pillars, carved with ancient runes, and above them a slab of black stone. Beyond it, the road stopped, not because it ended, but because it passed into something else, not darkness, not light, a place that did not know time. The child stood at the edge, breath slow, their fingers closed around the rosary, once more still warm, still trembling faintly. Behind them, the footsteps halted, and then a voice, soft, familiar, "You dropped this," it said. The child turned. She stood in the mist. The girl from the chapel, the voice from the woods, the sobs behind the wall. Her eyes were empty, but her face was their own, not identical, but possible, like a reflection, seen in water that isn't yours. The girl held out her hand in it, a piece of bread fresh, warm. The child did not reach. Instead, they whispered, "You can't come." The girl tilted her head. Her smile flickered. "I already have." And then she vanished, not into the mist, but into the child's shadow. The fog pulled back, as if satisfied. The child stepped beneath the arch, and the black road at last turned, not left, not right, but inward, into the place where names are kept, where smoke is born, where the lost wait not to be found, but to be remembered. The road was no longer stone, it was silence, and in that silence the child walked on, toward the place, where the last door would open. The final path was not a road. It was breath. Each step the child took no longer echoed, no longer stirred dust or mist. The world had gone still utterly, absolutely still, not even the sound of blood in their ears, not even the soft rustle of wool on skin. There was only movement, and the sensation that movement itself was no longer allowed. And yet they walked through a place not made of earth or time, but of memory layered so thick it became a landscape. Stones that were not stones, but regrets hardened into shape. Windless trees that held no leaves, only scraps of prayer cloth, faded and torn by mouths long dead. Nothing grew, but everything remained as if this place collected what the world tried to forget. Here, the black road dissolved entirely. In its place, only the shape of direction, carved into the mind. Ahead stood a house the child had never seen, but had always known. Its windows were shuttered, yet light pressed weakly from behind them, flickering, unstable, like a memory trying to survive its own fading. The chimney wept a pale, cold smoke that did not rise, but clung low to the ground, circling the threshold like a ward. The door was open, just enough to invite, not enough to welcome. The child stepped forward. Each pace brought with it fragments, their mother's voice humming barley songs beside the hearth, the sound of a bell tolling where no priest remained, a lullaby stitched with wrong notes, the sobbing behind the wall. The hallway beyond the door was narrow, as if the house had been built not for people, but for secrets. On either side, doors that did not open. At the far end, a mirror. Cracked dot, they approached it slowly. The reflection was not their own. It was the house itself, not as it was now, but as it had been. Walls unburnt, floor swept, bread rising in the hearth. The sound of laughter thin, real, human, and then, in the reflection, a figure. The girl, her hands were at her sides, empty. Her dress was the same linen, colorless but this time. Her eyes were filled with something worse than smoke. They were filled with need. She reached toward the child's reflection, and the mirror shattered, not outward inward, a soundless implosion, glass folding in on itself as though it was swallowing history whole. And where the mirror had been, now stood a stairwell, descending, Always down. The child followed. They no longer felt the weight of the rosary in their cloak, but they carried it all the same. The staircase narrowed, then widened again into a vast cellar, or what might once have been a cellar. Now it was a vault, a sanctuary of the forgotten. The walls were shelves, hundreds of them, thousands, and on each shelf a single object: a child's boot, a chipped tooth, a ring worn smooth by prayer, a bone doll, a braid of hair, a cracked pitcher filled with stale ale. The ledger stood in the center, bound in black hide, its surface scarred and pulsing faintly, like something breathing through stitched skin. The child approached. On the cover, no title, just Handprint, small. Familiar. They opened the book. No ink, no script. Each page held a single thing, a memory felt in full. No narration, no distance. Just sensation. Page after page. A mother rocking her child to sleep, coughing between lullabies. A brother slipping into stillness beside a cold hearth. A father digging without tears. A door that would not stay closed. A candle that refused to die. Each memory burned, slow and sacred, behind the eyes, until the final page. There, pressed into the parchment, was the child's own breath, still warm, still forming into a shape not yet known. And in that shape choice, the girl stepped forward, silent, no longer across the room, no longer behind a wall, no longer a shadow. She stood beside the child now, not threatening, not pleading, simply present. She raised her hand, not to take to offer, in her palm a key, rusted, ancient, wrapped in ash. The child understood the last door would not open itself. It had to be chosen, not because there was treasure behind it, but because behind it waited silence, true silence, the kind that ends a story, not with a scream or a fire or a name, but with peace. The child reached for the key. Their hand trembled, not with fear, but with memory, the weight of all they had carried, of all the footsteps in the smoke, of all the voices that had called them from the dark. And then, without words, they turned not toward the door, but toward the girl, and they gave her the key. She stared at it then at them, and for the first time her mouth did not open to mimic someone else's voice. She whispered her own, "Thank you." She placed the key on the ledger, folded her hands, and closed her eyes. The cellar brightened not with light, but with clarity. The fog lifted, the breath returned. The black road, invisible for so long, stretched outward once more, but it no longer led down, it led home. The child turned, their eyes wet but unafraid. Behind them the ledger closed, the candle extinguished, and the girl simply remained at rest. When the child stepped into the doorway, they found not a house, but a hill, grass, real grass, cold, damp, and living wind. Wind moved through it. The stars returned. Somewhere an owl called. They were alone, but not abandoned. They carried every name, every cough, every step in the smoke with them now, not as weight, but as witness. And as they walked the final road into the dark, the door closed behind them, not with dread, but with grace. The child walked until the stars faded again. But this time the dark did not feel cruel. It felt wide, soft at the edges, like the inside of a cloak drawn close around the shoulders. The path beneath their feet had changed, was no longer stone, nor smoke, nor memory. It was something quieter, more forgiving. They had passed out of the house, out of the ledger, out of the smoke-thick rooms where history clung like frost to rafters, and now the world held its breath, as though waiting to see what the child would do with all that had been given and all that had been lost. They came to a field, empty, moonlit. The frost had not yet melted, but it gleamed like silver under the pale sky. At the center of the field stood a single wooden post, and hanging from it by a frayed rope was a bundle, wrapped in burlap, not moving, but not forgotten. The child approached slowly, with reverence. With ache, they knew what this was, a burial that had not been finished, a remembrance that had never been spoken aloud. The bundle was too small, a child's shape, tied with rough twine at the feet and shoulders, no marker, no cross, no stone to name what had been taken. Just the rope, the post, the frost. They knelt. Their fingers brushed the burlap, and suddenly they were there again. Not the road, not the monastery, not the smoke, but the hearth. The first one, the one where their mother still hummed barley songs, where the breath of sleep drifted between ribs like fog over river stones. The child was smaller now, warm, watching the copper pitcher on the floor catch the light of the fire. It was morning before all the silence, before all the ash, before the brother coughed and didn't stop, before the child learned to drink in place of praying, before the plague knocked on every door and took without asking. In this memory, everything still held, but memories are not merciful. The hearth flared and turned to embers. The song cracked and turned to sobbing. The breath caught and turned to silence, and the home became a ruin. Once more the child returned to the field. The bundle still lay before them, but now the frost had melted around it, as if the very earth had finally warmed, enough to take back what was its own. They untied the rope, unwrapped the burlap, and there beneath coarse cloth and years of silence was the doll, the same bone doll from the cellar shelf, the one with the cracked head and the hand-stitched eyes. Its face was turned upward, its chest bore a small iron pin. The child did not flinch. They removed the pin, held the doll close, and laid it gently into the thawed earth. No prayers, no prayers, no eulogy, just presence. That was enough. The frost pulled back. Like a tide, the rope unravelled itself from the post, and the wind returned low, warm, brushing the field like a breath of spring. Something had shifted, not in the sky, not in the land, in them. The child stood, no longer waiting to be led. They walked beyond the field into the trees where no smoke followed. The branches bent gently to let them pass. The birds had returned, quiet birds, nesting in hollows and rustling from bough to bough. Life, slow and trembling, had begun again. And then they saw it, a figure ahead, tall, wrapped in a tattered cloak, back turned, as though listening to the forest speak. The child stepped forward, and the figure turned. It was the father, older, bent, but still him. His eyes held both shock and sorrow, but also something deeper, recognition, sharpened by time. "You made it," he said, voice cracking. The child nodded. "I couldn't follow," he whispered. "When she took me, I lost the thread. But you kept it, even through the house." The child reached into their cloak. They drew out the rosary, still warm, still whole. He took it in his hand, pressed it to his forehead, then he handed it back. "It belongs with you now," he said. "You're the keeper." The child opened their mouth to ask what that meant, but he was already fading, not dying, not vanishing, just returning to where he had been held all this time, back into the soil, back into the ledger, back into memory. The child stood, alone once more, but the weight on their shoulders no longer pressed them downward. It steadied them in the distance. A bell rang, but not one of warning. A morning bell, calling the living, not the dead. The child followed its sound. They passed through one last clearing, and there, on the other side, was the village, not the cursed one, not the silent one, a new one, built from stone older than plague, roofs thatched not with fear, but with care, smoke curling upward from chimneys, warm and thin, scented with rosemary and boiled grain. A woman stirred a pot outside her door. A child chased a goat through the mud. A baker dusted flour from his hands and waved. The world had not ended. It had simply been waiting for someone to carry the names through the dark, to walk the black road and not flinch, to return what had been taken, to bury what had not been mourned. The child walked into the village. They would not stay, not forever, but for now there would be bread and laughter, and a bed that did not smell of peat and sorrow, and in the house where they slept, smoke would still rise, but it would be the kind that feeds, not the kind that blinds, the kind that remembers, but does not chain. And when they slept, they dreamed not of bells or broken dolls or doors that watched, but of hands in warm water, a name whispered without fear, and breath that did not burn. The ledger had closed, but the story did not end. It had only finally returned. Home, the village, had no name, or perhaps it had once, but no one spoke it aloud any more. Not out of fear, but because the people here had learned that not every place needs a name to be real. Some places are known only by the feeling they carry, and this one felt like breath finally exhaled, like a prayer whispered not for deliverance, but in thanks. The child stayed longer than they meant to. Days folded into nights, folded into seasons. The frost thawed, the fields sprouted, the roads mended themselves, slowly with each footstep of life returning. No bells tolled in mourning. No doors creaked open to reveal smoke or bone. It was a place of small sounds. A spoon in a bowl, a child's laughter against a stone wall, the soft hum of someone tending cloth. But beneath the surface, quietly, reverently, the child worked. They listened to the stories the villagers would not tell aloud, of sisters buried hastily in fevered nights, of fathers who went out into the woods and never came back, of names scratched into beams above beds, then forgotten as dust gathered. The child, now older, kept a book of their own, not like the ledger from the cellar, not bound in skin, not fed by pain. This one was simple, cloth-bound, frayed at the edges, pages stained with ink and time, but each page held a name, each name held a place, each place remembered, and as they wrote, they felt it, the weight shift, as if the road behind them, all its smoke and sorrow and shadow, was not erased but carried now with balance, not as a chain, but as a thread, woven into something larger than grief. One autumn, as the leaves turned a deep rust red, the wind brought back a sound they had not heard in years. A bell dot, not from the village, from somewhere deeper, older. They rose before dawn, wrapped themselves in their cloak, fingers tracing the rosary once more, not for protection, but for direction. They knew what it meant. The bell was not a warning, it was a summons, not to danger, but to closure. They followed the sound beyond the village, across fields turned golden with harvest, past trees that no longer whispered secrets, through mist that no longer hid teeth, until they found it, a door, standing alone, just as before, but this time not blackened, not waiting. It was open, and behind it stone steps leading downward, but not into darkness, into light, a pale, soft light, the color of dust caught in morning sun. They descended slowly. The air was warm, dry, still. At the base of the stairway, they found a chamber, circular. The walls lined with shelves once again, but these shelves were empty, waiting in the center. A pedestal upon it. The ledger closed. UNMOVING. The child grown now, but still carrying the ache of their beginning approached. They placed their cloth-bound book beside it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ledger opened, its pages turned, one by one. Though no wind stirred, it reached its end, then turned one page more, and on that page, their writing, not transcribed, accepted, the ink shimmered, fused as if the ledger itself had said, yes, yes, yes. This, too, belongs. Yes. This grief is remembered. Yes. This name is now held. The chamber pulsed once, softly, and from the walls, light emerged. Tiny slivers, not torches, not flames, names, dozens, hundreds, flickering across the stone in scripts, and symbols from every village, every chapel, every forgotten road. They danced like fireflies, they settled like blessings, and in their center stood the child, witness. Witness. Not of death, but of what survived. The girl appeared once more, not as a shadow, not as a warning, as herself. She smiled not with longing, not with sorrow, with peace. She stepped forward and handed them something small, spool of thread black, strong, unbroken. They took it with reverence, understood the work was not done, not because grief remained, but because memory must be tended, carried, sewn, into each new place, each new name. The girl turned, faded gently into the wall of light, no longer watching, no longer waiting. At last, at rest, the child climbed the stairs again, out of the chamber, out of the door. The sky above was pale and wide. The bell had stopped ringing, but the air still sang, not with voices, but with quiet, the kind that comes after a story has been told true, and now in the wind others would hear it in other valleys, other villages. A child might stir in a smoke-filled room and dream of frost melting. A mother might light a candle that never quite goes out. A father might whisper a name he once buried in silence. And far down the black road, where the fog no longer gathers, someone will walk, someone will carry. Someone will write, not for themselves, but for the ones who had no words, and in the distance, steady the bell will ring again, not because someone is lost, but because someone is finally remembered.